Hi, Acadiana. I'm meteorologist Dave Baker. Happy Tuesday to you. This is Let's Talk Tropics. We've got quite a bit to talk about over the open waters of the Atlantic Ocean, and we still are watching an area over the Caribbean and maybe the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico. But anything that's going to be developing down to our south that would have a direct impact on us is really going to be developing quite slowly. And looking at some of the newer models here this afternoon, we're starting to see a lot of different ways that this thing could or may not develop. And then after that, all bets are off when it comes to direction of movement, timing, as well as any current track. So we'll get to all that in just a little bit, but it is a very pretty day outside, although it's starting to get a little bit more humid out there. And as far as the temperatures, we're holding at 88 degrees with our dew point at 67. So it is feeling very summer-like out there, even though we have now turned the page on October. Occasionally here in Acadiana, we still end up with a couple weeks worth of September, but extended models are starting to show a little bit more progression of some of those cold fronts. And I think by the time we get to the mid part of the month, we'll be talking about more fall-like type of weather. Currently, though, it is a pretty day. We've got sunshine out there mixed in with some clouds, and looking at our traffic cams and kind of paying attention to the skies there, at least on the Butte LaRose cam, you can see some puffy clouds there off on the eastern horizon, and we'll see a mix of sun and clouds with temperatures hovering right around 90 degrees. Of course, today is October 1st, and many of you, if watched Acadiana Weather Today's Let's Talk Tropics, have probably already seen this particular graphic. But for those of you that are new to the show, this is some of the areas where we would generally expect tropical systems to develop and track during the month of October. A lot of times things do start to shut down a little bit more over the far eastern Atlantic, although we're not seeing any signs of that right now, considering that's where all of the action is right now. But we also have what's called the Central American Gyre that does start to kind of get a little more active toward the second half of the season, particularly in October and November. It's also pretty prevalent at the beginning of the hurricane season, which is why we look for more development a little bit closer to home in June and early parts of July. And then as we get into October and November, it's these areas that tend to be more of the development zone, very similar to what we see during the early part of the hurricane season. But most of our tropical systems, when they do develop over the western part of the Caribbean, a lot of times they do tend to push off across possibly the Bahamas, southern Florida, and then eventually getting back out into the Atlantic Ocean. So right now, looking at what we have developing down to the south, not super concerned about it, but I do think it's going to give us some elevated chances for rain at the very least by the time we get to the weekend. So let's look at the big picture. And on the U.S. satellite, we've got a bit of an upper trough, and that kind of extends here down across parts of Mississippi, Alabama. It's still kind of what's left of Helene. And then we've got a bit of a trough that's also out here over the Gulf of Mexico, providing some cloud cover and even some scattered showers over the Yucatan Peninsula. And you're probably also noticing this little bit of rotation here counterclockwise. This is more of an upper low, and that's something that's going to come into consideration with the development of anything that might be in this particular area where the National Hurricane Center is currently watching. And as far as the Gulf of Mexico satellite, again, you've got that bit of a boundary there that's across the central part of the Gulf of Mexico, right about in there, and that's concentrating the showers and thunderstorms south of that area. So we're going to be continuing to see some of those rains and the moisture trying to build south of that boundary coming up over the next several days. And for those of you who might have some boating plans later this afternoon, or some of you might be watching on some of the offshore platforms out there, really not a bad day out there. We're seeing variable winds generally out of the north now at about 5 to 10 knots, and seas running about 2 to 3 feet, maybe 3 to 4 as you get beyond 60 nautical miles. So today we're going to start more in the central and eastern part of the Atlantic. Yesterday we had a dissipating Isaac, a struggling Joyce, and a newly formed tropical Tropical Storm Kirk. Well, Isaac is out, and you know what? So is Joyce. The National Hurricane Center has issued its last advisory on Joyce, and it should get absorbed by a frontal boundary and kind of pull on toward the northeast. So we're going to focus a little bit here on Tropical Storm Kirk that is getting a bit stronger now, and winds are up to 70 miles per hour, so it's getting very close to hurricane strength, and we can see that as well here on the Eastern Atlantic satellite. We've got a couple of areas. This is Joyce up here. That right there is our tropical system that is pushing off toward the northwest, and then we've also got another tropical system here that's trying to develop back toward the southwest, and that one actually might become Leslie. So Kirk is currently a tropical storm, but winds with 70 miles per hour. It is going to be forecast to become a hurricane, and there are a lot of indications it's going to have enough characteristics to generate its way into a major hurricane, and it does appear that there's also going to be external factors that are going to allow it to become a major hurricane. Right now, it appears that it's going to stay over the central Atlantic, turning away from Bermuda and getting caught up in a trough, and therefore shouldn't be a problem to anyone. But I also did want to point out that there is another tropical wave that's currently over the far eastern Atlantic, and it's right about in here, and this is our newly formed disturbance 91L, and the National Hurricane Center has been watching this now for about a day and a half, putting a fairly high chance for development. Direction of movement is going to be generally off toward the west-northwest, and the intensity models on this is bringing it up to a tropical storm within a day or two, and then many models bring it up to a hurricane farther down the road, especially as you get down to days 5, 6, and 7 there in the latter part. We're going to talk a little bit about this right now. The thinking is that this is just going to stay in the Atlantic Ocean, but we will point out a few things in some of the extended models when it comes to what probably will become Tropical Storm Leslie here. So earlier we were more concerned that we were going to see another name system kind of developing here over the western part of the Caribbean Sea. We still have a tropical wave, and we've got an upper level low that's up here. But right now things just don't look too exciting at this point. There is moisture gathering now over the southwestern part of the Caribbean, and that's kind of the focal point now for the National Hurricane Center, but this upper level low is not going to allow the northern part of that to have any chance for development, so that's why we're kind of focusing more a little bit farther toward the south. But that's kind of one piece of the puzzle when it comes to whatever might develop here down to the south. Again, you can see that upper level low spinning there over the northern part of the Caribbean Sea, just west of Cuba right in here, and then this is that tropical wave that we were talking about just a little while ago. But we also have what's called the Central American Gyre, and it's kind of a broad low pressure area that kind of spins here over the middle part of Central America, and you get some disturbances that kind of roll their way around, and occasionally they can help to whip up a system out in the western part of the Caribbean Sea. Some of the models are indicating that. And then there's also a hint on a couple of the other models that along with this gyre that's out here in the central part of the Atlantic, perhaps something might be a little bit more active down here over the Pacific and then try to work its way across Central America, southern Mexico there as a broad low pressure area and perhaps get something in the Bay of Campeche. So we're going to go through the different models here, and I do have it zoomed way out this time. Normally we kind of focus on the western Atlantic, but because we have these other tropical systems that are out in the Atlantic Ocean, I kind of wanted to point out a few characteristics about some of those. So we're going to start out here with the GFS, and for right now we're going to focus on this area here, and you can see there's kind of a broad low that starts to develop over the western part of the Gulf, Bay of Campeche area, and then you get kind of a low that just meanders out there and really kind of fizzles out as we get into the middle part of next week. So as I said, anything that's going to develop out here, if it even does, is going to be slow to occur. And the final solution with the GFS going out 10 days really just kind of has a broad area of low pressure out here in the middle part of the Gulf of Mexico. really not bothering anybody except for maybe the offshore folks with some gustier winds and also some more widespread rain. But there's also several troughs that are going to be moving here across the northern part of the country that may tend to pick it up and maybe kind of turn things back out into this direction. But then there's also the chance that it's going to miss those and just kind of stick out here in the middle part of the Gulf of Mexico. So that's what the GFS is suggesting right now. The Euro model, again, not quite as robust as what the GFS, even though the GFS really isn't pointing at a whole lot. I did want to show you that, again, a broad low pressure area here over the middle part of the Gulf of Mexico later this weekend, and then going into the early part of next week, it just kind of meanders down there, being missed by several troughs. Notice that our other two systems, Kirk and what may become Leslie here, are forecast to just stay out in the middle part of the Atlantic Ocean. A trough should pick both of those up and turn those both off toward the north. The GFS solution, by the way, as we go back on that, kind of showing the same thing. You've got Kirk, you've got Leslie, and notice how they just kind of turn their way off toward the north and stay out in the middle part of the Atlantic Ocean. So let's move on to the Canadian model, which has a slightly different solution. Rather than focusing on the western part of the Caribbean, it's kind of taking a piece of energy off the Bay of, or the Gulf of Tehuantepec, which is actually on the Pacific side there of the Mexican, the southern part of Mexico, and a little more of a broad low pressure area developing there and then nudging into the Bay of Campeche. And then very similar to what we're seeing with the GFS and the Euro model, just something kind of meandering here in the southern part of the Gulf or Western Caribbean and missing a lot of these troughs that are kind of moving across the northern part of the country. So, but the other thing I wanted to point out was, remember, here's Kirk. Here's Leslie down here to the south, so I'm going to kind of highlight Leslie. Notice on this particular model, the Canadian wants to bring Leslie a lot farther off toward the west, missing some of those troughs. Now, this is only going out 10 days, and it does appear at the very end of that loop that there's a decent trough here that should be able to pick it up. But I will note that on the Canadian model, this is bringing a tropical system much farther toward the west rather than turning it over the middle part of the Atlantic Ocean. And then finally, the Icon model, which only goes out 7 days, is also kind of similar to what we're seeing with the Canadian, maybe kind of a low pressure area developing either in the Pacific over the southern part of Mexico or the Bay of Campeche, and then having a low kind of meander. But the Icon is a little more progressive, going out 7 days to kind of kick that out, perhaps getting picked up by a trough that will be moving across the upper parts of the U.S. So a little bit different, where you've got the GFS, the Canadian, the Euro that just kind of has something sitting out there, while the Icon model tends to push it a little bit farther off toward the east. And then out in the central part of the Atlantic, there is Kirk and this is Leslie. And because this only goes out 7 days, it's kind of inconclusive of what Leslie wants to do in the far term future when you're going out 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 days, since this only goes out 7. But it does seem to have a little bit more of a westward movement compared to what we were seeing with the Canadian model. So the possibility of watching some of those out in the middle part of the Atlantic, right now it doesn't appear these are going to affect the continental U.S. nor the Caribbean. But we'll just watch the models just to see what's going to be happening over the next couple of days. Couple of things that are going in the favor of that low a little closer to home are the water temperatures, of course. Those are quite warm once again, and the tropical cyclone heat potential is very high there. If you're new to Let's Talk Tropics, this is 80-degree water, not just at the surface, but how deep it goes. Even with Helene moving across that area just a week ago, we haven't seen a whole lot of change in the tropical cyclone heat potential. So if a tropical system can get the right atmospheric conditions, it definitely has the good fuel in order to develop. So it's going to be more about the atmospheric conditions. And right now, the tropical wave that's down to the southwest Caribbean is under a low wind shear environment. But as I said, that upper low that's moving west of Jamaica and south of Cuba is providing a lot more wind shear. So nothing's going to develop on the north end of that tropical wave. If anything's going to develop on that wave, it's going to be way down here where you've got lower wind shear. And if this upper low here continues to kind of drift off toward the west, then we might catch some of this lower wind shear rolling in tandem that could be over this area farther down the road. And if that happens, we might have a better chance of seeing something developing over the southern Gulf or the Caribbean. So right now there's really nothing to worry about at this point. It's just one of these waiting games to see if something actually develops, and then once it does, see how the models kind of handle on intensity, track, and timing after that. So it is going to be a waiting period, but for right now, next several days, you've got nothing to worry about. Just kind of watch this and check in with social media over the course of the next several days. But none of the models are really predicting anything too strong right now. Of course, that could change, and you know what? By tomorrow, we could be talking about something much stronger, possibly getting in the Gulf of Mexico, or we may be talking about the models showing absolutely nothing developing. So it is way in the early stages right now, so there will be a lot of changes. So the tropical weather outlook, of course, is going to continue to keep that particular area in a medium chance for development. Now, I want to point out that this orange shaded area is not a track. Now, the tropical wave, the initial place that the National Hurricane Center is watching, is that X. And that tropical wave has the potential, by the arrow, to be moving into that particular area. But over the next 7 days, you could have development here, 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 or anywhere within or very close to that orange shade. But this is not pointing out a general track of anything, just where something would develop. So as you're looking at that shape, and yeah, it looks like a cone coming toward Texas and Louisiana, but that's not how you want to read this. It's just that blob area is the place where we're likely to see a better chance for some tropical development. And then, of course, in the far eastern Atlantic, you can see that red X there with the red blob. Very high chance for development there, and that's why we think we're going to see Tropical Storm Leslie coming up in the next couple of days. And I did want to point out, too, the Global Tropical Hazards Outlook, which goes out week 2 and week 3. So the new one is going to be issued a little later this afternoon. Unfortunately, it comes after Let's Talk Tropics. But it's really going to be interesting to see if they keep this area here a little more active going into, which will be starting tomorrow. And then the following week after that, we're going to have to see if this stays active here. It looks like things are trying to calm down maybe out there. Hopefully we will see a smaller an area of development as we start to get into that following week, which is going to be October the 16th and beyond. So beyond 2 weeks out. So at least from last week's advisory, we're still looking at active conditions here at least through the middle part of the month, but this will be refreshed a little bit later on today, and I'll have this particular graphic with the updated version for you on Wednesday. One last thing before I let you go, just to kind of give you an update on the progress of the season. So far this year, we are now on our 11th named storm. Remember, we've had 12 systems, but one of them never got a name. And over the course of June, we had 3 named systems developed. So we were ahead of schedule. And I know you're saying, well, what about Beryl? That one hit in July. Well, it actually formed in June. So we had 3 form in June, none form in July. We had 2 that formed in August when we normally would get 4 during the month of August, but then we managed to catch 6 named storms during the month of September. So that made up for what we didn't have in August. So right now we are still up for a normal season, and we've got 1 new system that may be developing here in the next couple of days, which would be our first one during the month of October. And during a normal hurricane season, we generally have 3. So getting up to at least a normal season doesn't seem too far-fetched right now, but some of the early season forecasts based on a La Nina developing and some of the other factors that we're putting out some of these very high numbers, that is going to be a little bit more hard-pressed, but most of our extended forecasts, preseason forecasts that we get, are really not as focused on the numbers of named storms that we have, but rather if we're going to have a below, a normal, or above average season, and all of the models were pointing toward an above average season. And at this rate, it looks like we're going to see at least a normal season, and if we can get up to 15, then we're above normal on there. So we we are in the ballpark of still at least finishing a normal season and maybe a busier season. We're ahead of schedule when it comes to hurricanes because we do think Kirk is going to be the 7th hurricane here, and we've already had 2 major hurricanes, and if Kirk, which is forecast to be a major hurricane, gets its status, then we're going to be ahead of schedule on our Category 3 or higher hurricanes as well. So even though the hurricane season doesn't seem to be panning out the way some of the early season forecasts were showing for something super robust, it right now still looks like we're going to finish at least normal or probably above normal. The chances of finishing behind schedule or below normal are starting to fade here pretty quick. So a busy season indeed, and I tell you, compared to when I first started in this business, the normal number of named storms we had was 10. So now it's 14. So it still seems like kind of a busier season, even when you start to get into the K, L, M, and N names, because back in the day, when you got to O, that was a little bit unusual. So looking like we're going to finish with a normal or slightly above normal season based on what I'm seeing right now. But again, nothing to worry about for the next couple of days. Just kind of watch this system and kind of keep up with the latest computer models. And I'll have more on this coming up tomorrow morning on Acadiana Weather Today, and then a full outlook on Let's Talk Tropics tomorrow live at noon. Well, I hope you enjoy our discussions here around midday, having lunch with y'all. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notifications too, and in between broadcasts, you can always follow my social media pages on Facebook and X. I'm meteorologist Dave Baker. Enjoy the rest of the day, and I'll see you on Wednesday.